Hi, and welcome to our second edition of What Hams Do, the TV show. I'm your host, Jay Silver, and I'm the Public Information Coordinator for the Eastern Pennsylvania section of the ARRL. We have an exciting lineup of guests and interviews for tonight's show, so let's look at what's coming up. We'll start off with a look at the news that affects amateur radio operators, and especially those here in the eastern 34 counties of Pennsylvania. We'll talk to 4 amateur radio operators from minority communities here in southeastern Pennsylvania and cover these topics. How did they get started in amateur radio? Is there a relationship between their professional lives and their ham radio hobbies? What role does emergency service play in their relationship to amateur radio? Is racism a factor in amateur radio? And what can we all do to expand amateur radio in minority communities? But before we meet our guests, let's shift over to the newsroom and check out the latest news. The lead story in this episode remains the FCC's plan to charge new amateur radio licensees a fee for their licenses and upgrades. This notice of proposed rulemaking we talked about in our last episode requires your direct input. The ARRL, the National Organization for Amateur Radio, is asking you to put your comments at the site shown on the screen now. The site link is also listed in the description below this video on our YouTube channel. Comments will be cut off by the FCC on November 16th. Now, most hams we've spoken to see fees as a real detriment to amateur radio growth among youth and hard-hit communities throughout the United States, affected by economic losses in the current pandemic. Once again, we are joined by our co-anchor, Frankie Bonte, call sign KE8HPA, now 2 months into her freshman year at Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. Frankie, what news do you have for us tonight?
Well, Jay, the Pennsylvania QSO party took place on October 10th and 11th. For those non-hams watching our program, the letters QSO, pronounced QSO, stand for a contact or conversation between 2 amateur radio operators. The contest participants try to get as many contacts as possible in the contest period, 2 days in this case. This year, the contest organizers report a 30% increase in QSOs over last year. In fact, there were over 98,000 ham radio conversations, including over 45,000 in Morse code. Of the total, our section of the ARRL, the Eastern PA section, contributed 18,718 QSOs. Way to go, EPA. The Pennsylvania QSO party is part of a national contest that carries on all year. Next year's party is already being planned. In other news from near Earth orbit, amateur radio operators in eastern Pennsylvania and elsewhere around the world tuned in to the web broadcast of a middle school question and answer session with an astronaut on the International Space Station. Astronaut Captain Chris Cassidy, who has since returned to Earth, answered questions from students at the Loganville, Georgia Middle School. Here's a small sample from the live YouTube broadcast on October 7th.
This is Steven. How long is your mission, and how do you expect it might impact your body? Over.
Hi, Stephen. We come for 6 months at a time. Our mission, our particular crew, actually is a little closer to 7 months. And the impact on our body is really 2 things. Radiation exposure is one thing we keep a close eye on, but truthfully, we're not at any more radiation dose than some high radiation fields on Earth, like a nuclear power plant worker or an airline a pilot or flight attendant. So that's in the keeping with the amount of radiation we get over our 6 months. And as well as bone density. And that's why we exercise a lot, is to keep our bones nice and healthy and dense so that we don't have rigid, fragile and frail bones when we get back to Earth. Over.
Now back to you in the newsroom, Jay.
So, Frankie, before we let you go, how is school going, and are you able to play radio in the midst of all your studies?
Well, I am just loving school right now, and one of my favorite things about some of my classes is that they really line up with a lot of amateur radio activities. Like in my physics, electricity, and magnetism course right now, all of our labs are revolving around building RC circuits with resistors and capacitors. So that's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Frankie. We'll see you in our next show if you can break away from the books for a little while. Finally, while some restrictions on outdoor gatherings have been lifted in parts of the eastern Pennsylvania section of the ARRL, in southeastern PA, most clubs are still finding indoor restrictions make face-to-face club meetings both impossible and too risky. Many are expecting the restrictions to remain in place for a good part of 2021. We'll keep you posted. And as a reminder, if you have news affecting amateur radio operators in our ARRL section, send it here. I'll put the email address in the description below this video on our EPA ARRL YouTube channel. And now back to the studio for the rest of tonight's show. We've decided to focus tonight's program on amateur radio in minority communities. For ham radio to grow and succeed, it needs to include everybody: young people, women, members of all minorities. There are lots of folks out there who think of amateur radio as an old white guy's hobby. It's not true. In our last episode of What Hams Do, we showed you young people, young men and young women, doing great things in amateur radio. There's a link to that episode in the description below, and tonight we'll talk to 4 people from minority communities in southeastern Pennsylvania who've heard that old white guy's description and know for a fact it's false. And while this is not a scientific survey by any means, it is good insight into where we are. 2 of our guests tonight, Keith Perry and Clint Beckett, are members of the OMIK Club. OMIK is a national organization that since 1952 has been promoting amateur radio in the African American community. As they respond to my questions about how they got involved, they'll both reference CB radio. Now, for those of you who don't know, CB, or Citizens Band Radio, is a low-power service available to anyone without any test requirement or knowledge of electronics. The radio range is limited, and it is generally used in commercial settings, often by commercial truck drivers. It was popularized by movies in the 1960s and 1970s. But it is not amateur radio, where licensed radio operators can reach around the world on high-powered radios and experiment in many different ways on many different frequencies.
And I knew something about radio because my dad did RF communications in the Army. So it wasn't foreign to me, but I played around with the shortwave when I was a kid too, when I was around the same time I was building the crystal radio. So I knew you could talk worldwide. I knew I could certainly listen worldwide, but the idea that you could talk mobily, that was the game changer, because this was we had pagers, but not cell phones, right? So this is like, mid-90s. So right sort of as we were changing over to the earliest cell phones. And I thought, man, this is cool. And I want to get into it, not just for sort of that side of it, just for wow, this is really cool. This is something that I want to check into, because for me, also being much more of a security person now than even I was back then, concept of personal security and being safe, you get stranded on the road. What do you do? My uncle and my father also had CB radio, so I knew about that. Wasn't too excited about that. I was younger, and I thought all this stuff juggling around in my head. Let me try something new, right? Because when you're young, you always want to you always want to show up everybody else. Look at the new thing I'm doing. Look at the cool thing I'm doing. You guys are so last year with that thing that you do. So I was led to it sort of a number of ways there. And yeah, I got licensed. Tech Plus had Technician Plus, which was the tech license, no code, was still fairly new. I think started late '80s, so I got licensed only 5, 6, 7 years later, and I was off to the races. Upgraded general in like August of whatever year it was, and then extra in, I think it was October or November. So it's in 3 months. I was like, oh, I'm just gonna get it all done. But there's something for everyone. Radio is one of those things, and I'm a communications guy first and foremost. That's really what my academic experience is. That's, my graduate work is actually in networking and virtual machines, but the networking side, that's communications. My undergrad, again, RF and fiber optics. So if we are communicating, I'm interested in that. Practical use of it is a different thing, but that's not what ham radio is about. It's about trying these things out and seeing what is going to work where. You have an idea, you're licensed, it allows us to experiment, and you can experiment with so many things these days because, there's a really significant gap between when I first got licensed and when I got back into it, really only 5 years ago. That's, as you know, technology, you're away from something 2 years and you don't know what's going on.
Each of our guests sees amateur radio as a key player whenever there's an emergency that takes down cell phones, electrical power, and even the internet. Just to name a few events in recent history, let's think about Hurricane Sandy, isolating one of the densest population centers in the world, Lower Manhattan, with no electricity and no cell phones. Think about this summer's Gulf Coast hurricanes, taking out power and cell phones. And let's not forget Hurricane Maria, isolating parts of Puerto Rico in 2016 for months. For Keith Perry, a native New Yorker like me, the eye-opening moment about the value of amateur radio in an emergency came on 9/11/2001, when his brother was supposed to be in a meeting at the World Trade Center and his dad had an official position with the city of New York.
That was very, scary for the entire world, right? But, being a native New Yorker, and I'm sure you felt this same way too, your city's under attack. But my mother was at Fordham, which is in the middle of the city. My brother was actually supposed to have a meeting in one of the towers. And my sister-in-law was somewhere downtown, not close enough that it, women scary. And I've got a brother in Connecticut and I'm down here. And my other brother who was supposed to have a meeting is in Queens. Tried to call people, couldn't get people. I'm freaking out. My brothers are freaking out. We're like, do we get in the car? Do we go to Jersey, pick them up, go, come back here, go to Connecticut, the whole thing. And the entire time, because I had my radio, again, I had my VX5R at that time. I remember thinking to myself, pack the car, take the essentials, make sure I was late. It was all laid out. The radio was there. And I remember thinking, God, I wish I had an HF radio.
Keith's DX5R operated on frequencies where it could only reach other stations within the line of sight. HF radios, or high-frequency radios, transmit on frequencies that go beyond the curvature of the Earth. In any event, as our interview progressed, I asked Keith about the old white guy's perception of ham radio.
It didn't register with me quite that way because I had always learned about radio from my father, who is black. And, he and my uncle were doing CB. They're black. So it didn't dawn on me the same way until, I guess, when I started teaching more just about communications, and I would mention ham radio every so often. And people, of course, say, wasn't that like CB? And I go, no. They're like, well, what is it? And I explained it to them. And, we had internet, people Googles, and you'd hear that, like, oh, that's some old white guy thing, And I would tell people, I said, well, no, it isn't. It's sort of, again, if most of the representation you see is of one group, it's certainly logical to make that statement. But there are a lot of things that are skewed that way just because certain things you learn from previous generations of, your inner circle. And your inner circle generally is going to be people in your own culture. And that doesn't mean you're excluded from it. That doesn't mean there aren't people in it. I think today, because of what's going on, there's a sensitivity to that and people feel excluded because sometimes there's no inroads in. Some clubs are obviously closed off and some people are just jerks. But at the same time, I think that, it's just like anything else. I've never had a problem talking to anybody in ham radio. See my face like, oh, it's a black guy, whatever. I don't want to talk to him. I've never had that experience. I wouldn't let it stop me even if I did.
When we talked about expanding amateur radio in minority communities, Keith felt that amateur radio is empowering. He put it this way.
Today, I think it's actually a harder lift, because if you talk about radio from the standpoint of communicating with other people at distance, people go, well, why not use the internet, right? They say, well, I've got my mobile phone. I can talk to people around the world on this. I can do video around the world on this. I can send data around the world on this. Why would I need a radio? And when you sort of walk them through all the ways cellular phones can fail, and regularly do, we just have been trained to deal with it. And then you tell them how radio makes you independent. You're dependent upon yourself and your own skill set. When you tell people that, that's empowering. So for me, and I would say you'll hear that word a lot when you talk about engaging with, let's say, generally minority communities. The word empowerment is something that you're going to hear in some way, shape, or form. When you talk to people about empowering themselves, that opens their minds up, right? So you don't talk about, I have a thing when I talk about technology. I don't talk about technology. I talk about what technology can do, right? So to get people into the thing, you don't talk about the thing, you talk about what the thing can do for you, right? Why is this useful? Why would I want a radio? Cell phone network is going to go down, okay? Is going to go down. And they go, what do you mean? It's going down. Those things aren't just, if you lose power, where do you think, what powers a cell phone tower? And they go, oh yeah, that's right. Okay, well, doesn't it have battery backup? A little bit, not a lot. What if a tree knocks down the power lines? Okay, what if it knocks down the tower? And again, especially when you're in the city, right? And in particular with African Americans, black people and brown people's analog for Latinos. Most of our populations are in the cities. And again, we don't think about these things, right? But you need to. Just because you live in Philadelphia or New York or Chicago or LA doesn't mean you can't lose power for more than a couple of days.
The ability for ham radio to operate in emergencies is a major aspect of the hobby, but it is so full with so many exciting things to do, experiments from basic electronics on up to creating our own over-the-air internet on Wi-Fi frequencies, that most hams never get bored. Now, let me introduce you to Clint Beckett, or Clint as he's known around the airwaves. Clint Beckett, a Marine Corps veteran, is an officer of the Delaware Valley chapter of the OMIK Club. I asked Clint how he got involved in ham radio.
So the mystery has always been, even from that tender age of 12, how does one talk over a radio with a microphone over the air? How does this happen? What makes this work? That was my foray into basically electronics in early days of CB radio, and eventually CB radio, it sparked my interest for a long, long time, but I wanted more. And there was a young, I won't say young, middle-aged gentleman that lived up the street from us who was a ham radio operator. And he was more or less a tinkerer. He knew how to do all kinds of things, in electronics. And he saw me tinkering, pulling things apart like radios or TVs. And he invited me to his house and he introduced me to ham radio. That's how I got my start in ham radio. Basically, how I got my start in the business I do today, electronics. That's what I do. So it's easy for me to say my hobby is my job, and my job is my hobby, because they're so interactive. Since my job is in communications, the aspect of amateur radio plays a very big part in what I do. In other words, the mystery of, okay, how do you talk on without wires connected to anything except for a telephone company? The fact that where ham radio has been very instrumental in developing some of the tech, in fact, a lot of the technology for the commercial radio business, amateur radio has played a very big part in that. So my interest is, okay, my hobby shows me these very fascinating applications that was eventually translated up to commercial radio.
Would you tell me about your experience as an African American in amateur radio?
That's an interesting question. I honestly have never really thought about I'll put it, making it simple. I never thought about my color in amateur radio, because initially when you're talking to somebody over the radio, you never know what that person looks like. I mean, you really, if we weren't doing this over a video realm, we wouldn't know what each other's color is. We can kind of assume, maybe because of the speech that we have and how things are pronounced or said, and maybe even a thought pattern. But as I think about it, I remember my mentor, my Elmer, basically was an older black gentleman who taught me CW. He said, this is how you're going to learn CW. And once you learn CW, this is how you're going to do different things. From him, I honestly said, are there any more than just what I see? And then he said, there's a whole lot.
I also asked Clint if the ARRL, formerly known as the American Radio Relay League, which represents amateur radio operators nationally, has any hint of the systemic racism we've heard so much about in recent months.
I think the league positions itself in that same context as being a colorblind organization in the aspect of the hobby and the way they run their business. They don't seem to, in my mind, they don't tolerate, or at least they never had to say they tolerated any disparity among the amateur community. There may be some, and it may be just the fact that there are people who just listen. They're bad apples. They're always going to be bad apples. You just have to figure out where they are. But I think the league positions itself in a good position when it comes to amateur radio. Because I think the amateur community, the total amateur community, carries itself really, really well. I mean, you can visit most of these, like Hamvention, Dayton. You go to Dayton, and you will see many colors of the community, and that includes women, that includes children, male and female, and you're just amazed by how the world, we see the world one way, and you're trying to figure out how does the world function when this community seems to get along, I would say 99.9% of the well without any issues. You take, like, for instance, I'll use myself or the Delaware Valley OMIK for example. We are, yes, in Philadelphia. We started a number of years ago. It is open to all colors. It didn't, in other words, we weren't saying this is strictly a black social gathering of amateur radios. It was open to everyone. And along with that, under that same aspect, was that you remember you have a lot of professionals that border a range that's unbelievable. I mean, we're talking doctors, lawyers, engineers, the guys who lay blacktop on roads, guys who wash dishes, cook in kitchens. The amateur radio community is so broad. And again, it includes females, because we have a lot of women. And if they're not necessarily on the radio as active hams, they are married to hams, and they're active in the community as well.
I have joined the OMIK Club in Philadelphia, and I can confirm what Clint is saying. It's a vibrant, multifaceted organization, and I'm very proud to be part of it. I should also mention that my discussions with Clint Beckett and Keith Perry were far longer than the bits we've edited for tonight's program. Longer versions of these interviews and the next two interviews you'll see tonight will be available as video podcasts on this very EPA ARRL YouTube channel. So remember to subscribe and click the notification bell so you know when new content is available. Now, first, I'd like you to meet a lady I found to be particularly inspiring in her work for the Red Cross. And now she brings her history of service to amateur radio. I asked Janice Winston, KC3ORH, to tell us about her work for the Red Cross.
Well, I started with the Red Cross about 17 years ago. Actually longer than that, because I first volunteered with the Red Cross during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And I was canteening at the airport when soldiers were coming through and had long layovers in Philadelphia, and the Red Cross was providing services. And when I retired, I decided that I wanted to go back again because of that experience. And because of the experience when I had to go to the Red Cross to get official notification to my son that his grandfather had passed. And the Red Cross was very instrumental in passing that message along through the military chain, as they always do. That is one of the services that the Red Cross does provide for service members around the world. Once my son came home, the Red Cross person was very caring, compassionate, and saw my family through that whole situation until my son returned to duty. And I always appreciated that care that I received from the organization. And again, when it came time to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, when it came time for me to retire, I thought, oh, I'll go look back at this organization and give something back to them. I started in restoring family links, which is actually a position where we receive letters from people overseas in situations that refugee camps at different places, and they would like to try to reach their family members in the United States. And my job was to find the family member and communicate the message to that family member. And then I'm going to work with the Red Cross during disasters. And that's where I'm at now, working in disasters and with service to the armed forces, where I work with the veterans at the military hospital in Philadelphia.
Oh, really? So now you've been doing some amazing work with the wildfire evacuees in California. Tell us about that.
Well, my job on the wildfires is to communicate with the State of California Emergency Operations Center and their CAL FIRE operations centers, and to make sure that they understand what the Red Cross is doing for the survivors, and that the Red Cross understands what the state is doing for the survivors. And we're making sure that our services are matching the needs of every survivor in California.
You know, the kind of feelings you have about providing service is what brings a lot of people into amateur radio. Was that what interested you in ham radio?
Funny you bring that up. Actually, we have ham radio operators across the Red Cross. I think about 300 of them signed up for an event that we're going to have coming soon. I just happened by chance was talking to one of our ham radio operators, and he told me that there were a couple people that were studying for a test. So I said, oh, that sounds interesting. Can I join the club? So I went and got my book. He provided me with the book, and his name is Bill Bianco, and he provided me with a book. And it took me about a week and a half, but I really concentrated so I could take the test with everyone else. And I was able to pass the test back in January. So I got my license.
You got your technician's license, and now I have heard you on the air in some club meetings and in the Amateur Radio Emergency Service of Philadelphia net meeting on Sunday nights. Are you interested in getting involved in the emergency services aspect of ham radio?
Well, I have used WinLink to send forms to the Red Cross. I'm learning that skill set. So I was able to download WinLink and get an account and send some forms to the Red Cross. And I've been working with a gentleman I think he's in Tennessee or North Carolina, and he has been guiding me on Red Cross policy of working with WinLink.
So you're already doing it. You're already getting involved.
I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I think I'm doing something.
WinLink is an amateur radio form of email that doesn't require the internet or phone lines. We can send emergency messages using Red Cross forms, for example, along with images and other files to other WinLink-capable ham radio stations around the world. If the internet is out, WinLink will still be there. Back to our interview. How's your experience with ham radio been so far?
Well, I haven't had much experience, but I will say it is a very welcoming community. I really have to say that. Harvey and Ed and people have just heard me on the air and coached me about different aspects of working with my radio, and even things like telling me, mark that place in your house where your signal is strong, so the next time you come on we can hear you. little things like that really help. And it makes you feel like you're a part of the community.
Geography, past practices in housing discrimination, and other economic factors have segregated our communities. And we find that amateur radio clubs that meet in one area tend to some extent, reflect the racial fabric of that area. How do we have our clubs become more representative of the entire amateur radio community? It's a question I asked Janice.
I think the best thing to do is to get the leaders on board, the leaders in each of the clubs, and have them have a real conversation with each other as to what they want to do and how they want to expand to make sure that all the clubs are inclusive. And maybe, when we go back to having meetings, having those leaders visit other clubs. The one way that we learn about people, that we grow, and that we are inclusive is that we meet each other where we are. We meet people where they are. It's not about changing people. It's about meeting them in that place. And having guests meet each other, go to each other's meetings, and maybe bring a person, another club member with them, could be the start of something very great.
Janice, thank you, and we wish you great success as you continue on your ham radio journey. Next up, Pastor Frank. Frank Rodrigeuz, KC3HRS, is not only a church pastor, but the leader of an Hispanic bilingual group of amateur radio operators who perform an essential service. My first question to Frank was, are there Hispanic hams in America?
Yeah, lots of Hispanics. Puerto Rico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Panama, South America, and locally, PASOLA members are I'd say 80% Hispanic, some African Americans, but we have kind of a mixed bag. But yeah, a lot of Hispanics.
Frank, tell me what PASOLA stands for.
The Pennsylvania Society of Latin American Radio Operators.
And how did that come into being?
Okay, in 2016, I was licensed as a technician. 2 months later, I became a general. And then in September of 2017, Hurricane Maria happened. And since I had just become a general, I was into the HF, went to 20 meters and started hearing a station sending traffic from Puerto Rico. And I think there was one other operator who was translating traffic from Puerto Rico into the mainland. And being a new ham, you know how you're going to fix ham radio and all that good stuff when you first get licensed. I figured there was a gap somewhere. I mean, PASOLA is not going to fill or remove people like Aries or Saturn. They do a wonderful job of what they do. I think PASOLA's niche is that we fill a specific gap in that we can pass traffic from the islands, especially the Caribbean, into the mainland, and we're bilingual, so we can pass traffic from Spanish into English. And I think that's something that we're very specific about. We have a traffic net that we run on Tuesday nights on 10 meters at 7 p.m. and at 8 p.m. on 2 meters. And we have over 200 traffic nets that we have done since 2017 when we started PASOLA. And the net itself is structured in that way to where we pass traffic back and forth, English and Spanish bilingual. And when the stations check in, if it's an English-only station, all they have to say is English only, and all the communications will be handled in English to them, and vice versa. If it's station says Spanish only, well, we pass traffic to that station in Spanish only.
So Hurricane Maria really created this interesting comprehension of a traffic problem that you were seeing. Now, were you talking to only people who lived in the Pennsylvania area when you got traffic from Puerto Rico?
No, actually, there was a station in Puerto Rico passing traffic over 20 meters. We would pick up the traffic, and the way it would work is he would come on at 12 o'clock with a car battery, plug it into his radio, and he would have, I think, 2 hours of transmission time. And he would start sending off messages that he was receiving. He would go outside in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and local people would come by and say, I need to get a message to such and such, and give him a phone number, the person's name, and a brief message. And that's what he was passing on 20 meters. We would copy this information and then locally call each and every person. The following day, we would repeat the procedure backwards. We would call him and say, well, we got in touch with such and such and such and such. And that went on for maybe the first 4 days where there was no communication into Puerto Rico at all.
Amazing. So you now have how many members in PASOLA?
Right now we have approximately 40 members.
Well, now that grew partly because of Hurricane Maria. Have you seen growth in Hispanic hams nationwide following that?
Yes, I have.
Frank Rodrigeuz also recognizes that we have separated into neighborhoods that lack diversity. I asked how we can make our amateur radio organizations more reflective of the entire ham community.
We're joined by something that does not apply in general to like our neighborhoods. We're not joined by a physical location or being able to congregate in physical space with somebody else. We are amateur radio operators, and we are on the airways. I've been to a couple of meetings at not Holmesburg, Frankfurt, and trying to get to some of these meetings in Philmont. I want to become a member of Philmont. I definitely want to become a member of Frankfurt, and I think it's something we should all do, and at some point come up with a way for all the clubs in the Philadelphia area and probably South Jersey to come up once or twice a year to a specific location just to have a mass meeting within the ham radio community to see how we can unite these groups. You don't have to become the member of just one group. Everybody will have their own separate groups. But how do we further this unity between ham radio operators when we do physically congregate together?
Frank is also part of a new technology effort in amateur radio, spearheaded by an organization known as ARDEN, or Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network. Like WinLink, we mentioned earlier, ARDEN stations function even when the internet and cell towers are down. The difference is speed.
At some point, cells are going to fail, the internet will fail, and now ham radio operators have an advantage of that we don't utilize any of those systems. And now through people like the stations that are starting ARDEN, the Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network, we can pass high-speed multimedia through Wi-Fi nodes that we reprogram and use at the 2.5 and 5 gigahertz frequencies, basically having our own internet and ability to have voice over IP video, send large files over ham radio.
ARDEN represents yet another way amateur radio stands ready in the event disaster strikes again. Now, one more thing about Frank Rodrigeuz. Being a pastor in a church in a minority community during this pandemic is an emotional as well as physical challenge.
The church is a full-time job. It's a very difficult job, especially now with so much pain and suffering and death. I've lost three real close friends to this pandemic, including my brother.
I'm so sorry.
March, I appreciate that. And it's very difficult when you cannot be physically present to console someone. And it has to be done on the other side of a mask, or it has to be done over the phone, or now we're holding services online, so we don't have a physical congregation. And that makes it very difficult for us to connect with our congregation, and it makes it very, very difficult to provide the service that pastors are supposed to provide.
Some time ago in the audio podcast now posted to this EPA ARRL YouTube channel and elsewhere on podcast services, we talked about amateur radio operators performing health and safety checks on each other. Despite loss and sadness, our amateur radio community continues to look out for one another. And for that, I personally am very grateful. Now, if you're watching this program and you want to get started in this amazing hobby, just search the web for Getting Started in Ham Radio. A link to a page on the ARRL website about how to get started is in the description below this video. And that concludes this edition of What Hams Do. Subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss video and audio uploads. And if you like this show, please share it with a friend. This is Jay Silber reminding you that this isn't your grandfather's amateur radio. Be safe out there. And as we say on the radio, WA2UAR is clear.